What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another live episode of the Officer Nate podcast. With me today is Officer Ryan Tillman, the founder of Breaking Barriers United. I'm excited to have him on my show. We're going to have a good discussion. But first, let's talk about your clothing. Are you ready to make a statement with your clothing and wear the flag proud, those red, white, and blue colors? State Patriot is a clothing and apparel company on a mission to honor our nation and its heroes. While their blue line dry fit shirts with UPF 50 sun protectant have won my heart in particular, State Patriot also offers a variety of patriotic gear designed to support all first responders and our military. Like the shirt I'm wearing now, it's a dry fit blue line UPF 50 sun protectant shirt. I love it. The hat that I'm wearing with the removable Velcro patch, you can wear one hat every day of the week, but have a different logo for each day of the week if you'd like. They got some really great stuff. It's comfortable. It fits really well. Check them out on Facebook and Instagram at State Patriot or visit www.statepatriot.com. Use promo code NatesWilden15. That's NatesWilden15 for 15% off your purchase. Now, with no further ado, let's bring in Ryan Tillman. Ryan, thanks for joining me, man. I really appreciate you being on my show tonight.
Nate, man, thanks for having me. It's always good to be back on with brothers on the other side of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we had a fun time when we were on the Officer Tatum's show. What was it? That was like a couple months ago. So
yeah, that was good, man. That was really good.
Yeah, that was a fun time. So just real quick for the audience, for the listeners and the viewers, just kind of give us a rundown of your background real quick, especially with regards to your law enforcement background.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll give you the short version of it. I've been a police officer for about the last 8 years of my life. And prior to that, I had no aspirations of being a cop. Actually, I despised cops just because of some of the bad experiences I had and then some of the bad experiences that some of my family members had. And so if you would have asked me when I was in college or if you'd have told me in college that I was going to be a police officer, I probably would have just laughed in your face. But God definitely works in mysterious ways. And
Yes,
so
sir.
he positioned me in a spot to do something that I least expected to do. And so fast forward, I found myself going into the profession of law enforcement when my wife got pregnant and your boy I needed to get out of doing side hustles and get a main hustle.
Right.
So I found law enforcement and, my life and my eyes have just been completely opened ever since I've been in. So like I said, I've been doing it for about 8 years. I've had a lot of success early on. I promoted to corporal probably it's actually 2 years. Actually, I think today is my 2-year anniversary that I promoted to corporal. So I just thought about that. So today's my 2-year anniversary that I promoted to corporal. And in doing so in my law enforcement career, about actually the first or second year into the profession, I started my organization, Breaking Barriers United, because I realized that there needed to be some type of education for those that weren't in the profession.
Yeah.
And I understood that because I was one of those that was always saying, stupid things or nonsense about the law enforcement profession, but had no clue of what it was really about. And so once I understood things from the inside, then it was I think it was at that moment in time that I needed to go outside and tell everybody what it was really about. So it's been a good journey, man. I've been doing this for, like I said, 8 years, and I've been on my business journey with Breaking Barriers United for the last 6.5 years. And I've had the opportunity to travel across the country, speaking to students in high school, to colleges, to corporate or private organizations, to police officers. I have my own podcast, and I'm all over social media doing Tillman takes, and then I've been featured on a lot of other stuff. And the only reason I say that is not to say look at me; it's just more so to look at God and what He's done in my life.
That's awesome, man. Well, I've been following you for a while now, and when you say you found your calling, I mean that's like an understatement, right? I mean you're out there, people are listening, and I really wish a lot more people would follow suit, right? Because you said it yourself. I mean, you were anti-cop, anti-law enforcement, and then you found yourself in it, right? You got an inside look at what was going on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, right? And then that totally changed your mindset.
Yeah, it did. And I wish, and I always tell people, some of the best cops are the people that don't know they want to be a cop yet.
Yeah.
And the reason that is because that's kind of how I was, and a lot of my views on certain things were kind of twisted. And I had a level of life experience that some people don't have. And it wasn't until I realized that being a cop was for me that I think helped me excel in the profession. So, not to say that the person that wakes up every single day and this is all they want to do, not to say that they're not a good quality candidate, but there's a lot of good quality candidates out there right now that just don't know that they want to be a police officer yet.
And it's a good point. That's how I got my start in law enforcement. I really hadn't thought about being a cop for years. I mean, when I was a little kid, I thought about it all the time, but then I kind of put it out of my mind, as I started getting older and pursuing other things and having different goals. But it wasn't until I sort of happened upon a police officer at the time, and she said, "Hey, we're hiring. You should come down and apply." And that was the first time I'd thought about it in years. And I was like, all right, I'll go apply and go test and see what happens, and was kind of nonchalant about it initially. But, like you said, I think if you approach it from a standpoint, instead of being so wrapped up and obsessed and passionate about police work, if you approach it from a more pragmatic standpoint and like, you know what, there's a job that needs to be done. There's a community that needs to be kept safe, and approach it from that standpoint, I think it makes for a much better police officer who has a much better experience in the job.
You have to, and that's the mature thing to do. Sadly, what's going on though is it's become pop culture to not like police officers, and I don't even want to say it's been like that for as long as I can remember. If you look back to Public Enemy #1 and all these, F the police and all this, like it's always been trendy. But I think it graduated or evolved from being trendy to being a lot of people's unfortunate reality. They live in this reality that police officers are dangerous, that we're there to kill you and all this other stuff. And because they fall victim to this falsehoods that exist, then it makes it a lot more difficult to take the blinders off and see law enforcement for what it is. I mean, even despite everything that's going on, when I was on Tatum's podcast, I was on his podcast again a couple of weeks ago, and I was telling him about some of the other industries like the medical industry. If people honestly knew how many people die from medical malpractice on a day-to-day basis, they would go nuts. You know what I mean? But they don't know, and so they choose to focus on law enforcement, which the amount of people that we actually kill or utilize unlawful force on is slim picking. So that's just my 2 cents.
Well, speaking of that, so you did a video like maybe 2-3 days ago about that incident where the U.S. Marshal punched that guy in handcuffs. And I saw that video you did, and I'm like, oh, come on, dude. Why, like after all the progress we're trying to make with the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community, and you're gonna go punch a Black suspect who's in handcuffs, like what? I understand, and I'm sure you understand too, because you're still on the job. I understand that sometimes your emotions, like they come to the surface with certain cases, certain incidents. But you gotta control it. No matter how strong it is, you gotta control it. Hitting a guy in handcuffs, no matter what color he is, no matter what color you are, is never. I mean, unless, like you said, sometimes people can be a threat even if they're in cuffs. Clearly, this guy wasn't a threat. He was being walked out of the house to a patrol car, and this guy just popped him in the face. I'm like, bro,
it was so hard to watch. And let me tell you this, and I'll tell everybody that's listening and watching this right now, I get it. As officers, and you know this too, Nate, like there are certain things that we have to see and deal with that are so hard. Like, and I think if I'm not mistaken, I think those guys, the suspect that was being walked out in handcuffs had just taken the life of a 6-year-old kid. So, let's throw that context out there first for everybody watching, so that way they realize, like, okay, the circumstances as to why this guy was arrested were pretty crazy circumstances that for anybody to stomach or process is difficult. So I understand why the emotions of an officer, especially on saying, I don't even know if that officer saw the child or not, but I could understand why his emotions were up there.
Right.
But I've said this before, and I'll say it again, is like, we as officers have to be held to a higher standard. And some people don't like hearing that, because when we say we need to be held to a higher standard, that almost comes off as like, okay, well, so what, you want us to not be human? No, it doesn't mean that we're not going to be human, but it means that we always have to be cautious of what we're thinking about. There's an old saying that says you have to think about what you're thinking about. And I kind of relate that to my spiritual life and certain things that I do, because if you're not intentional about thinking about what you're thinking about, you're liable to do something that you shouldn't be doing. And so as hard as it is, at all times, at all hours of the day, you should be trying to keep your mind guarded, especially if you're a police officer out there watching this, or aspiring police officer. There are going to be times where your emotions are going to get the best of you, because you are human, and that's okay. But those are the times that you have to take your thoughts captive, so that way it prevents you from punching somebody in the face. Because even though you may have got that, 2 seconds of gratitude because you punched this guy in the face that just took the innocent life of that 6-year-old, what it's doing now is it's now going to damage you. It's going to damage the face of your agency, and it's going to damage the face of law enforcement as a whole. Yeah. And so, like I said in that video, we take 2 steps forward, but when you punch that person, we now take 10 steps backwards.
Yeah, exactly. Just to give the audience a little bit of a background. So like you said, the suspect that they were arresting, he was a suspect in a double homicide that took place in Canton, Ohio. After I watched your video, I had to do some research. I'm like, what is going on here? Like, why is this agent like so wound up? What made him do this? So I went and did some research. So that suspect that they were arresting in the video, he and another guy were suspects in a double homicide in Canton, Ohio. It sounded like a drive-by shooting from the reports that I read. It was like a spray and pray. The guy that they were targeting, they hit in the arm, and he was injured, taken to the hospital. But they killed the 5-year-old, like you said. He was sitting in the back of his mother's car, little Hispanic boy, and then they shot and killed an adult male, an adult black male. Now, I did a video on this because I saw some other videos on YouTube. I think it was I don't want to mess up his name. I think it's Dr. Rashad Ritchie. I don't know if you've seen any of his stuff, but he on his show, he broke this down. Now, here's the thing. I don't want people to misunderstand. I'm not defending the U.S. Marshal that punched this guy in handcuffs. What he did was wrong, and I'm sure he'll probably get fired, and that's probably an appropriate response to this. Yeah. But the Dr. Ritchie was trying to get people to believe and point out that it's police culture. This is what happens in police culture, and he was condemning all of the other marshals that were present because they didn't step in and do something. And if the guy wanted to, he could have just jumped on this guy and kept pounding him, and those other marshals weren't going to step in and do anything. My response to that was listen, I understand what this marshal did was wrong. It was unjustified, but it amounts to what is pretty much a simple battery. Okay, it's a misdemeanor in any other context. Now, but they're trying to make that the issue instead of, okay, how about the 5-year-old that was murdered? How about the other guy that was killed in this incident? I get we have to hold that officer accountable, but let's focus on the real issue. The real issue is that the murder rate is out of control in this country, and young kids are being victimized as sort of like collateral damage for all of this violence that's going on. But they don't want you to focus on that. They want you to focus on the racist police officers who are victimizing black suspects. And it's wrong. It's dividing the country further.
Well, here on that same topic is not a police culture thing. It's a human culture thing. And the reason I said it is because human nature is the most unpredictable thing that that you can't predict. I mean, that the most unpredictable thing in life is human nature. You can look that up. And so when people go out there and make this thing a police culture thing, it's not a police culture. It's a human culture thing. We're human beings. And that's what a lot of times people forget is because we're human beings, we still have the same emotions that a lot of other people have on the sidelines. I always bring this point up with people when I'm talking to them about similar topics. I always say, like, let me ask you, when's the last time you've gone out and just had somebody just for no reason cuss you out, cuss your family out, cuss your wife out? And when's the last time they did that? When's the last time you just let them do it and not have any type of response at all? As a matter of fact, just walked away. And usually when I have that conversation or ask them that question, a lot of times it's like, well, I'm not walking away from that. I'm either going to punch them in the face or I'm going to do this. And I'll ask them, well, why are you going to do that? Well, because you're talking about me. They're talking about my wife. They're talking about my kids. I'm like, so you're asking officers do something that's not natural. You're actually expecting us to do something that's not natural for any human being to do, which, like I said, we should be held to a higher standard, which is why we should be able to walk away. But you have to realize is that we're still human beings. And so we still have to even be intentional about trying to do something that's not natural for any human being to do. So it goes back to the whole point that officer punched that suspect in the face, not because he was trying to continue a police culture that's abusive and things like that. No, he punched him in the face because an innocent 5-year-old kid was killed, and they also killed another person. And if you're any human being, any righteous human being, that should make your blood boil more than anything. That's why he punched him in the face, not because he was contributing to a bad police culture.
Right. And not because he's racist, because there's no evidence that was the case, right?
No.
Just like you said, it had a lot to do. I'm sure it had a lot to do with the fact that this 5-year-old kid was killed. And as a police officer, those are the hardest types of cases to handle, is when children get victimized, and especially when they're killed. Mm-hmm. That's very emotionally disturbing and infuriating. Yeah. But again, that's not to excuse what the marshal did. Looks like we got the Officer Tatum in the chat here. I don't know can you see that?
Yeah, I see him. He says, "Wash hands."
Yeah. But I wanted to address this comment right here, that bad guys don't deserve leniency. So thanks everybody in the chat for participating. So that damn guy, I'm not showcasing your comment to demean you or bash you. But what I wanted to say is, we've spent a lot of time over the past several months talking about how suspects don't have the right to resist arrest. They don't have the right to fight with the cops, and they have to be held accountable when they do those things, because we've seen this narrative and this trend that they shouldn't be, that there should be no accountability. There shouldn't be any consequences for the behavior. And if police officers attempt to hold them accountable, then the police officers are the bad guy. Well, on the flip side of that, we have to hold officers accountable as well for the mistakes that they make, like this marshal did, punching this guy in handcuffs. Now, I agree that bad guys don't necessarily deserve leniency depending on the circumstances, but that's to be handled in court, not out on the street. And again, that's something that we say to the public all the time when it comes to resisting arrest. Don't fight the cops in the street, fight them in the courtroom. Mm-hmm. Well, the police officers have to remember that and hold themselves to that standard as well. So thanks for the comment, though. I appreciate it.
Nate. That's a great way to address that, for sure. And I was going to say the same exact thing, is like, if we want to really bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, we can't have a double standard. It just can't. So I get it. There's been plenty of times where I want to punch a lot of people in the face. A lot. I'm not going to lie to you. There have been times where in my mind, I'm like, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. But in my mind, I'm like, I'm going to punch you in the face. You know what I mean? But right. I can't do that. I have to believe and trust that the court system is going to do that as well. So,
yeah, and to go back to that, I mean, if you were to watch that video, if you haven't seen it, if you guys don't follow Ryan on Instagram, it's Breaking Barriers United on Instagram. He did a video about it. You can see my video on YouTube, and I don't think it's on Instagram yet, but you can also look it up online. What it shows is it's a Ring doorbell camera, and obviously from the point of view of the doorway, and it shows a few U.S. Marshals standing outside, and one of them is escorting the suspect out of the house, and he's in handcuffs. And as they walk past one of the marshals punches this guy in the face, and he falls to the ground. Now, some of the critics are saying that these marshals just stood around and let this happen. Well, they couldn't have anticipated, first of all, that this marshal was going to do that. I doubt very highly that he said, "Hey, when this guy comes out of the house, I'm gonna punch him right in his jaw." He probably didn't say that, but another thing is that they were probably just as shocked as everybody else was to see that go down. So they're probably standing around processing it for a minute. Just because they didn't jump on the marshal and throw him in handcuffs for committing a misdemeanor battery doesn't mean that they condoned it or agreed with it.
Well, and people, we also got to be realistic too. Oh, and again, if you're watching this and you're not in law enforcement, think about how you would handle misconduct at your own job. Just think about this for a second. Think about your job, whatever it is. And if you saw one of your friends or your coworkers doing something that was not, lawful, not ethical or immoral, how would you handle that? Would you intervene right away? Right. Or would you wait, tell a supervisor and handle it that way? Like, we got to be realistic. And that's what kind of gets me baffled. Unless I see another officer that's unlawfully taking the life of somebody, or actively, it'd be different if that officer kept punching this dude in the face and those officers just stood around. That's different. But he delivers a punch which caught everybody off by surprise, one. And two, who knows to say what happened after that? I don't know. Maybe they didn't do anything. Maybe they didn't say anything. But let's just say they did. We got to be realistic. If you're on whatever job site you're at and you see somebody doing something they're not supposed to be doing, how are you going to handle it? Are you going to jump in right away and say, you shouldn't be doing that, I'm walking you straight to the boss's office? Or are you going to say, you know what, I'm going to tell the boss, but I'm not going to physically take this up with this officer right here or there because it might escalate things? So we got to be realistic. Not to say that officers, there's not a time and place sometimes where officers should jump in. I can show you videos where it would have been a perfect moment for an officer to intervene and stop an officer from doing something that they were doing to a suspect. But this was not one of them. This was a quick emotional reaction by an officer who did something that was not right. And it should have been taken up with that agent, that officer supervisors right away by the other officers. And for all we know, they could have did it. They maybe they didn't, but we don't know. So we can't just sit here and say that the officer stood by and did nothing because we don't know the rest of the story to that specific context.
Yeah, I mean, for all we know, one of them, as soon as they got that suspect in the car and on the way to the jail, they could have made a phone call to the supervisor right then and said, "Hey, we just had an incident that you're going to want to be aware of and probably look into." We don't know that. We don't know that they didn't do that. They probably did.
Yeah.
But the other thing you have to think about too in a situation like that is officer safety. You still have an insecure or an unsecure scene there, right? You've just arrested a homicide suspect in a house where there's probably more people. So you don't have time to address that issue right then and there. It's not the place, like you said, unless he's continuing to assault the guy, and he's on the ground punching him in the face. He punched him once, it was over and done with. Okay, we got to get this guy out of here and we got to get away from this scene, and that we can address it later at the office. Like that's the time and place for that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Have you been following the Gabby Petito case at all?
A little bit. So we talked about it last week with Tatum, and then I haven't really kept up with it too much. I do know that they had, what's his name, the bounty hunter out there looking for him.
Oh yeah, Dog the bounty hunter.
Yeah, Dog or something like that.
He's working hard, man. He's on the news every single day, just wading through swamps and.
I just cracked up at what my man's outfit is, man. Like my man is like straight from the 80s.
Yeah, like Crocodile Dundee.
Oh yeah, gone wild,
hybrid,
bro. Exactly.
Well, there's all this sort of this controversy surrounding the domestic violence incident that those Utah police officers responded to, when they were in Moab. And I watched the video. I watched both body cam footages from that incident. And you've got so many people coming out against these officers going, "You guys missed it. He pulled the wool over your eyes. He's a narcissist. He's an abuser. He's this, he's that. You guys didn't do your job. You were apathetic. You let him go. How could you do that? Now she's dead and it's your fault." And I'm like, whoa, time out for a minute. Just time out. Did you watch that footage at all?
I saw short versions of it. And then like I said, I talked about it with Tatum. And here's my thing. And this is just, again, this is my opinion. And I could be wrong but with the limited knowledge I have of it. But I don't think that it was that the veil was that like they missed it or anything like that. As a matter of fact, to my understanding, she actually assaulted him and he had injuries consistent with her assaulting him. In my experience with domestic violence, we go on calls like this all the time. And at the time, it actually seemed either she was the aggressor or at the very least it was a mutual based off of witness statements where they said they saw him strangling her or whatever.
Yeah.
So based on witness statements and then also based off of injuries that he sustained by her, it appeared that it was mutual. I think where the officers might have dropped the 8 ball is they should have either at the very least taken both of them to jail or even taken her. But they needed to remove one of them or both of them into the care of the county facility or whatever, the jail, and let them sort that out. And so that way they can let the dust settle. That's why that's in place. A lot of times people don't realize is that in domestic violence situations, at least here in California, there is verbiage that says we shall make an arrest anytime there was an unlawful assault from one person to another. So it can be, like I told somebody before, I said I arrested this female one time because she threw a pizza and hit the other dude, her significant other in the face. I asked him, I said, "Hey, did you want her to throw the pizza at you?" He said, "No." Well, per the penal code, that meets the elements of unlawful touching from one person to another. So she went to jail for domestic violence. Yeah. A lot of times people say that that's petty or that's chicken crap or whatever. But you got to understand the reason why that's in place. The reason why it's in place is because when you take somebody to jail, the idea is it allows the dust to settle. So that way, whenever that dust settles, maybe the argument kind of de-escalates itself in and of itself. But two, it also removes the liability on behalf of the law enforcement department, because we can say, hey, we went there, we found out that there was some type of assault that occurred, and therefore we took somebody to jail, removing that aggressor from the scene. And so we did our due diligence to make sure that a murder doesn't happen. I think that's if that is the correct information that actually happened and what really actually happened out there. I think that's where the ball might have been dropped. I think maybe it was a lack of, I'm not really trying to take paper on this, so therefore I'm not going to take paper, but I could be wrong.
Well, and you might be right. It'll be interesting. Well, and I don't know if we'll hear the results of it, but I know that that department down there is doing an internal investigation on their officers to see if there was anything that they missed or any policies that they violated. I know in looking at the domestic violence code in Utah, there's similar language in there about, you shall make an arrest. But in listening to, I think it was the backup officer, he's kind of having a little sidebar with the other officers and sort of making a plan on what they're going to do with these two. The circumstances, I mean, it was a tough situation because you got two people, they're from out of town, they're living in this van together. They don't have any family in the area. There's nowhere for either of them to go. They end up getting him a motel room and giving her the keys to the van, where she could have just driven away and, and left him there. But the one officer is like, well, here's the thing. He's like, we've got the female who, based on all of the evidence, based on one of the witness statements, based on her statement and based on his statement, she was the predominant aggressor. She was hitting him with her cell phone. She was scratching him. She was punching him while he was driving. All evidence points to her being the suspect in this case and being the aggressor. But she weighs 115 pounds soaking wet. He's a bigger, stronger male. He can defend himself against her. They're both saying, I don't want the other one to get in trouble. I don't want her to go to jail. He even says, can you take me to jail instead and let her stay in a motel? And so they're like, what do we do here? Like, we could follow the letter of the law and take her to jail, but is that really justice? Is that really the right thing to do? I think one of the things that people forget or make the mistake of doing is they think that the officers should have been able to anticipate that she was going to be murdered 2 weeks into the future.
Yeah.
You have to remove all of the information, after this particular incident, because the officers didn't have any of that information. They didn't know that she was going to go missing. They didn't know that she was going to be found dead. They didn't know that he was going to hide and go into hiding from the FBI. They didn't have any of that. To them, it was a petty dispute between lovers, between a couple, and they were trying their best to resolve it, without a 22-year-old girl going to jail and, getting a misdemeanor charge for something that they feel like they could have handled without taking that action. So,
well, what I'll say though is, like, we often hear as officers the term complacency kills. And usually we associate complacency with, hey, I was just talking to a dude at the side of my car and then he pulls a gun out and ambushes me because I wasn't ready for it. But what we don't associate it is complacency with the other areas of our job. And I use that in this scenario is our hearts as officers sometimes are like, can we resolve this at the lowest level possible sometimes? You know what I mean? Like, because it seems like it's petty, and like, you're right, we don't have a glass ball that we can look into and see 2 weeks down the road. But that, to me, kind of could become complacent in our thought process. And one of the things that I do is, and I'm not perfect in this, so I don't want people to look at me and think I'm perfect, but one of the things I try to do is I always try to look, and especially in domestic violence situation, is what is the worst case scenario. And oftentimes in domestic violence, the worst case scenario is somebody gets killed. And so in the complacency part is like, you know what? Is it worth it to take them down to jail when we can just let them go their separate ways? They've agreed to go their separate ways. Or is the looking 2 weeks down the road, the liability standpoint, you know what? I know it sucks. I know it's stupid, but I'm going to take somebody to jail and let the courts figure it out.
Right.
That's kind of like the road that we should well, that's kind of the thought process we should have. And I tend to do that. And every time I've made a mistake in my profession, because there's been plenty of times where I made mistakes and it came back to bite me. Every single time that's happened was a time that I actually tried to take the path of least resistance, where I was like, oh, you know what? Let me just take a shortcut here. Let me just let you guys go your own separate ways. And then hopefully nothing happens. And every single time, it never fails, I get a call from the watch commander. Hey, can you come to my office? And then I'm like, yeah, what's up? And they're like, were you aware that when you let them go back, this person, end up doing this or whatever it may be? But it's always the times that I always, in my mind, I thought I was doing the right thing by trying to take the path of least resistance or the shortcut, when I'm like, man, that's one of the places I should have been letter of the law instead of spirit of the law. And so if you're watching this, no, I'm more of a spirit of the law type guy. And if you're not familiar with what that is, that means that anytime that there's laws in place, but you don't always have to go directly off the law, you have some level of grace and mercy that you can extend to people. Whereas the letter of the law is, hey, you know what? This is what the law says. This is what the law is. And therefore, I'm going to act on what the law says. I am more the spirit of the law type of guy, which I like to give people grace and mercy. But there are places in my job where I tend to be more letter of the law than spirit of the law. And domestic violence is one of those.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cutting corners is definitely not a habit you want to get into as a police officer, especially when dealing with domestic violence scenarios. I guess one of the things that I keep thinking about in my head, and one of the things that I tried to bring up, I did 2 separate videos on the Gabby Petito case because I kept getting so many comments on it, and people like from both sides, like the officers did a good job, and then there's other people who are like, no, the officers did a terrible job, and they're like, why didn't they arrest someone? And my thought is, well, okay. So the purpose of making an arrest in a domestic violence situation is one, there's a no contact order that's put in place to keep the two separated and not being able to text or call or anything like that. And then 2, like you said, you take somebody to jail, it gives them time to cool down. The dust kind of settles a little bit. But most of the time, unless it's on a weekend, the arrestee will be released the next day, right? So I think what the officers might have been thinking in their minds that, okay, if we get Brian a motel room, put him in the motel room for the night, we give Gabby the keys to the van, she goes and stays in the van, and if she believes she's in danger, she can drive all the way home to Rhode Island, or she can come to the police department. Either way, we've accomplished our goal of separating these two for the night so they can calm down, compose themselves a little bit, and then they'll reunite the next day and continue on with their trip. So I think the outcome probably wouldn't have changed if they had made an arrest. But I could be wrong on that too. I could be totally wrong.
But that's a liability. At that point in time, you're thinking liability. You got to think like a supervisor at that moment in time, because when you do the first way, which again, it makes perfectly. If I was those officers, it sounds like a completely logical plan. But looking down the line is like we're assuming that they're also going to do what they said they're going to do. Like we're assuming that Brian says he's going to stay in his hotel room and Gabby says she's going to drive home, or like we're assuming that that's what they're going to do. And I'm again going back to all the times I've gotten in trouble. It's because I assumed that somebody said that they were going to do what they were going to do and they never did it. And so at least the jail way is like, you know what? Brian goes back there the next day and kills her. I can say, hey, I was there yesterday. I took his butt to jail. He went back out. I couldn't stop that from happening because we weren't there. Right. As opposed to the other way is like, well, yeah, he went to his hotel room, and then when y'all left, he went back and found her. So again, I just think it's more of sometimes we have to think, and I think as street level cops sometimes, which technically, even though I've been promoted, I'm still closer to the street side than I am the administrative side. Yeah. Sometimes on the street side of cops, we have to be able to think administratively. We got to be able to think big picture. We got to have that global picture, because even though you're not an administrator or a supervisor, if something happens, they're going to still come back to you. And so that's one thing I've learned early on in my career is like, there may not be a supervisor out here, but I'm sure it's better to think like a supervisor from a liability standpoint, because this is going to affect me and my family.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good way to think. I mean, if you can think about it from all different vantage points, and all different perspectives, definitely gives you a much bigger picture, a much more complete picture in how you can, make a decision or what sort of enforcement action you should be able to take. So that's a good point. I was going to ask this, I just thought of this with your Breaking Barriers United organization and all the public speaking you do, and the videos you do. Have you ever gotten any flack from your department with any of that stuff?
It's a great question. That's probably one of I get that question a lot. So from top down. So let's start there. With my supervisors and everything like that, I've never actually I don't want to say never, but for the most part, since I've been doing it, I've always had a supportive supervisory team. The time I did catch flack, it was because I didn't dot my I's or cross my T's. And it was one of my peers that actually exposed that to them. So they had to move. So it wasn't even their fault. It was one of my fault. And it was just one of my peers being my peers, or one of my haters being my haters, and they took it above me. And so the supervisory team had to act. Now, from some of the people that are like my peers, like side to side,
Yeah.
I've definitely taken heat from them. And I don't even want to call it heat, but just people showing their emotions. And I've had, some people thought I was doing this for the wrong reason. Some people thought I was doing this initially. When I first started the organization, I had people thinking, oh, he's doing it to kiss up. He's doing it to get promoted and this and that. No, I was doing it because I saw a problem that needed to be fixed and I wanted to be a part of the solution. I think with time, as I continued doing what I was doing and it moved beyond just an idea and people actually saw what was happening from it, I think people started taking me more serious. But then the level of scrutiny I was taking started to morph a little bit. It started to evolve from, oh, he's just doing it to get promoted, or he's just doing it to kiss up, to, who does he think he is type thing, you know what I mean? Because I was having success. And so I think this is a good time to kind of insert why personal development is so important. Now, I will tell you, overwhelmingly, a lot of my peers and everybody are very supportive of what I do now. A lot of naysayers have become, some of my biggest supporters now. But I wouldn't have been able to get through that had it not been for personal development and self-development. And what I mean by that is, like, one of the things I like to do is reading. So if you guys are watching this, make sure you guys go pick up my boy Nate's book, Never Off Duty, because that's the way to improve yourself. But
thanks, brother.
But personal development is critical. And no matter where you're at, whether you're a police officer or not, just in life, it's good to have, because you can't always wait and depend on those outside of you to tell you the words that you want to hear. Sometimes you got to go out and find those words yourself. And so if I would have just waited for people to give me the affirmation that I needed, I may not have been in the position I am now. It was because I was intentional about going out there and finding that self-development to carry me to the next plateau that I was going to reach. And so I've definitely had my fair share of haters, and it wasn't just at my department. It was all around. I've taken heat from police department or police officers all across the country, but I've had more supporters than I've had naysayers. And so I think the times I've faced criticism is because people just don't understand what I do and what my heart is, or they'll only see one video and automatically categorize me into one thing without actually knowing the full side of me. So I always tell people, like, don't just judge me based off of one video, judge me based off of everything I'm doing, judge me based off of the totality of my work, as opposed to one video you see. The idea is for you guys not to always agree with me. The idea is to just be open to a different opinion from somebody else, and maybe it can change the way you think, or maybe not, but at least we can have a educated conversation about it.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important lesson for people who, might be on the fence about doing a certain thing or going after a certain goal. If you wait until you have a certain number of people behind you, or, expressing their approval of what it is you're going to do, you'll probably never pull the trigger on that. Right. Because you're never going to have 100% support, most likely. I mean, if you do, great, God bless you. But I've experienced the same thing you have. There's almost as many critics and haters as there are supporters. But you can't back down from it just because people don't agree with you. There's always going to be people who don't agree. There's always going to be opposition. There's always going to be somebody, for whatever reason, does not want you to succeed. Right.
Yeah.
They don't, they want to try and throw as many wrenches into the gears of your success as they possibly can. And you just got to keep grinding. You just got to keep going, no matter. I mean, if you didn't face adversity, it probably wouldn't be as worth it or as meaningful, right?
No, and not to go spiritual, but like I'm doing a Bible study right now, and there's this book I'm reading by Tony Evans, who's a pastor out of Texas, called Detours. And in that book, it talks about the detours that we take in life and how sometimes we get, it caught up in this woe is me mentality, and like this, like, why am I doing this? Why am I going down this path? But you got to realize is, like, God works in mysterious ways. And sometimes those detours are put in your life to strengthen you for where your destination is supposed to be. And so you got to kind of have a different outlook and a different view on what your detours are in your life. For me, I like to dream big. I like to dream that one day I might be at the White House as an advisor talking about how we can change law enforcement for the better. And so if I want to be on that plateau, if that's like my pinnacle of my career, where I'm an advisor to whatever president is in office about police and law enforcement relations across the country, how much criticism do you think that I might face at that level?
Yeah.
And so if I can't handle criticism down here at a local level, how do I ever expect to handle criticism at the bigger scale? And so, I've kind of chosen to look at detours as a blessing for me, because the faster I can get past that detour, the faster I'll end up at my destination. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard, because sometimes detours are freaking painstaking. Some of them last longer than others. Some of them were like, man, is it even worth it to keep doing this?
Yeah.
But if you keep focused on what the bigger goal is, man, that detour is just going to be a shortcut to get you to your destination.
Absolutely. I wanted to show you this comment from Denise. Thoughts on systemic racism? I mean, it's a hot topic. It's a hot button issue still. I don't think it'll ever not be a hot button issue. I mean, I hope so. I hope one of these days we can get this resolved, but that's a long ways down the road. What do you think?
So here's my reality of systemic racism. And this is why I say my reality, because my reality and my opinions are different from everybody else. I think we have been led to believe that in our society today, things are systemically racist that aren't, and we're actually forgetting or not even touching on things that really are systemically racist.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you might see, like, I'll go back to that police video we talked about earlier, where you see that white officer punched the black guy. It's very easy for somebody to say, and again, this is just an example. I'm not saying this is what happened, but this is just an example. It'd be very easy for people to say, oh, see, it's because this is a racist system. It's a racist culture that allows and protects these officers that have allowed behavior like that. No, that was an individual decision that officer made that's not reflective of a system of law enforcement that is systemically racist. The reason I say that is because if law enforcement was a systemically racist profession, then I would be a part of that systemic racism, actually going out there being racist to everybody else in the system.
Right.
So we have to realize that law enforcement right now is not systemically racist. Just because it's allowed minorities from all races to be a part of a profession, and they're out there going and doing good work.
Yeah.
What is systemic racism to me? Systemic racism is when you look in the communities and you see where some of the money is and where some of the money is not. Systemically speaking, if you go back to our history, you look at civil rights and in the slavery days, money was taken out of impoverished neighborhoods, and because of that reason, anytime you have poverty, anytime you have people that can't get resources or money, naturally what you're going to see is them have an adverse reaction to it and still go out there and survive, because we have this, as humans, we have this survival mode that we go into to protect our family, get resources and stuff like that. And so if you don't have methods of obtaining money or making money logically or systematically, then you're going to revert to committing crimes and doing all this other stuff. So I think from an educational standpoint, we're still suffering effects from systematic racism. From an abortion standpoint, we as a minority community are still facing issues from systemic racism, which, if you look at the statistics, Black people are more apt to have an abortion than any other race out there. To me, that's a systematic problem. If you look at if you look at the financial system in certain places across our country, there has been wealth that has been removed from certain neighborhoods. That's a systematic problem that we are still dealing with from our ancestors. And so that's where we need to take our attention and focus on if we want to talk about fixing systemic racism, as opposed to sugarcoating things and just casting a blanket on everything and saying it's all systematic racism. So that's kind of like my frustration. That's why I read books about Frederick Douglass. I read books about Martin Luther King, and I I try to find out what were they going through, what were the issues that they were facing. When you read about the Black Wall Street, and you read about how in Tulsa, Oklahoma, all this wealth was in there by African Americans, and it was all burned down to the ground. That has had long-lasting effects on generations to come after that. So that's why I focus so much on giving a lot of minority kids exposure. I'll give you an example. Today I was on the golf course because I love golfing. And if you turn on the TV right now, if you watch golf, how many Black people or Hispanics or things like, how many of them do you actually see on the golf course? Not a lot, just because traditionally speaking, that's not a sport that we've taken up. Obviously Tiger Woods was an anomaly, but we don't really see them out there thriving. But I was telling my buddy that I was out there with who's very successful in the music industry, very, very successful, connected to the highest people in the industry. And I was like, this is a place where we need to be bringing young black and brown kids out here and experiencing what it's like to just be on a golf course. Because it's not only is it cool and fun, but it exposes you to, etiquette. It exposes you to having conversations with other successful people. It's a place where you can network and stuff. This is where they need to be exposed to. So I think we really need to reshape what systematic racism is. We can't just say everything is racist, because how are you supposed to identify what really is racist when it happens? Because racism sadly still does exist in some ways, but we've been led to believe that certain things are systematically racist when they're not, and then the things that are, we don't even talk about.
Yeah. Going back to something you said just a little bit ago with regards to officers being protected under that sort of that blanket of the systemic racism that's embedded in law enforcement. I've never, I mean, I'm sure some officers get away with some things, and we might not hear about it, but I have yet to see an incident that the nation is aware of where an officer has gotten away with misconduct. That doesn't happen. It doesn't get swept under the rug. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, Derek Chauvin didn't get away with murdering George Floyd. Okay. Mm-hmm. He's going to rot in prison. Mm-hmm. Right. There's just this U.S. Marshal that we were talking about. He's not going to get away with punching that black suspect in the face. Mm-hmm. He's going to probably face termination and might even catch a charge for it. Mm-hmm. So those things happen. Unfortunately, yes, it's something that needs to be addressed. It needs to be fixed. But a lot of those things, like you said, are on an individual level. It's not as though police agencies are training their officers to go out and go, okay, listen, if the suspect is white, cut them a break. If they're a person of color, throw them right in jail. That doesn't happen. There's no policies on the books that are discriminatory against people of color as opposed to white people. There's no laws in place that I'm aware of that are discriminatory or prejudicial. So we have to start calling a spade a spade. We can't go on national TV and go, look at the system that's protecting these corrupt officers. There's no protection for those officers. You can't even do a viral video in your uniform and and keep your job. Okay. There's no protection in place. Most of the time, like you said, officers are held to a higher standard. Not only are they held to a higher standard, but they're held to a different standard, right? Name any other job where you do a video that goes viral on social media and you get fired for it, except for maybe the military, right? Like most people have more freedoms and privileges in their employment than police officers do. So to think that police officers are getting away with murder, they're getting away with stealing drugs and beating people down, I'm sure that there are those instances still in some places where officers on an individual level get away with some things. But to claim that happens systemically, that the system protects those officers, there's no evidence to show that.
Listen, in order for it to be systemic, it has to be a system that was put in place and training people to be this way to fit in the system.
Right.
Like you said, I didn't go to the academy. They didn't tell me, hey, you need to arrest this many black people, this many white people, this many Asian people. That's not taught. You know what I mean? So if
Can you imagine?
Hey, you need to make sure you go out there and arrest those 10 black people. You're lagging in black people today. Oh, you only see 5 white people in the book. That's a little over your quota. That doesn't happen. You know what I mean? But the reality is has it happened at a certain department or departmental levels? Yes. You can Google that right now. There was a chief in Florida a few years ago that was actually arresting black people unlawfully. Like he was out there targeting black people and certain things, and he was arrested for it. And so he was still held accountable. So I guarantee you, if you were to go out there and ask a majority of officers what some of your number one stresses are about this job, it's not going to be the stress of losing their life. Losing your life in law enforcement is definitely a stress, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. That's why we react certain ways. But that's not what kind of just plagues my mind. Like, oh man, like I'm so stressed that I'm gonna lose my life. It's just kind of like I've been trained to react and respond to that if that were to happen. If you were to ask most officers what their number one stress is, it's internal stresses of not screwing something up and facing not only termination, but litigation from a decision I made. That's probably one of the number one stressors. And so if this was a systematic problem, why would officers be so afraid of the system that they work within? And so that's why, but again, it goes back to the whole pop culture thing. Like people automatically assume because one person said that law enforcement is systematically racist, that it must be true. People can go look up right now and say, did man ever land on the moon? I'm sure they'll find 100 million reasons of why man never landed on the moon, and you got people believing it.
Right. When I think back on my own career, so since my book came out, I've had obviously some critics come out and go, well, does your book expose all the corruption in law enforcement? And I said, well, that depends on what your definition of corruption is and how widespread you think it is. Now, when I think back through my almost 13 years of law enforcement experience, there's a few incidents I remember. We had an officer who was charged with lewd conduct with a minor. He was arrested, charged, found guilty, and is doing some prison time. We had another season. So we had a DARE officer. He was a DARE officer when I was in elementary school. He was a detective when I started working with the police department. He was investigated for distributing narcotics and charged and arrested and convicted and did his time for that. And even my last department, Bellevue Marshal's office here in Idaho, before I started working there, it was right before I started working there, the current marshal at the time was selling marijuana. He was selling edibles and weed and stuff to people in the area. He sold drugs to an undercover Idaho State investigator and, charged, convicted, all that stuff. So they're being held accountable. The cops that are messing up, the cops that are violating people's rights, the cops that are committing crimes, they're being caught and they're being held accountable. So there's none of this sweeping things under the rug. There's nothing like, let's just not talk about it. Maybe it'll all go away. No, officers are hammered for that kind of stuff.
Bro, TV makes corruption look and appear more widespread than what it really is.
Yeah.
Majority of TV shows you see on TV are what? Cop shows. So I always tell people it's funny. Everybody's sure that for y'all to hate cops so much, you sure do like watching cops. Cops is one of the most popular, or cop shows are one of the most popular things you'll see on TV. But sadly, a lot of times in those shows, they always portray officers as being so corrupt. Now, don't get me wrong. There are stories you can go back, for days. You mean LAPD and, the Rampart scandal. That's corruption. It is corruption. But is that a systematic problem or is that a human nature problem? It's a human nature problem because you have guys that got way too much power, way too much freedom, and they're using it for the wrong things. That is corruption. But does it plague the whole system? No, it doesn't. Because if it plagued the whole system, then I will be a part of the same corrupt system at my department and doing the same things. I always tell it's funny. Like I always get this question, especially when I talk to a lot of civil rights people. Like they're like, man, Ryan, we love what you're doing. We love your work. We love how you call out the bad guys and stuff like that. So you're like, all right, cool. We've been waiting to ask you this. Tell me about a time where you've seen corruption at your own department. And I'm like, I haven't. And like their jaw drops like, what? Like, oh, there's no way. Oh, you must. I'm like, no, seriously. Like, I was like, one, if people know what I do and what I stand for, do you really think that they would be doing corrupt behavior in front of me? That's the first thing.
Right.
That's the first thing.
They'd be the subject of one of your videos on Instagram.
Exactly, right?
Viral.
So people tend to kind of stay away from doing stuff like that. Two is don't be confused with what you see on TV all the time. Just assume that corruption happens at every single department. Does it happen? Yeah, but it doesn't happen as much. I guarantee you there's probably corruption in a lot more other professions, a lot more than ours. You just don't know about it because it's not under as much scrutiny as law enforcement is.
I'm in the same boat, man. I had people ask me the same questions like, well, what about at your department? What kind of corruption happened there? Have you ever reported a corrupt officer, an officer who was, violating rights or whatever? And I said, no, that never happened when I was, when I was working for my agencies. I worked with a lot of good men and women. They were good, honest, scrupulous people. Nobody was planting evidence. We weren't beating people down in a dark alley, stealing their dope. That just didn't happen. I get it that those things happen in movies, like you said, and it's glamorized in Hollywood, right? Like the corrupt officers. But in reality, that stuff happens, like out of all the contacts that we make with people, a fraction of a percentage of the time.
Yeah. Well, and the last thing I'll say, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if you're an officer watching this, one of the things that I also kind of, I don't want to say I get bugged by it, but I do get bugged by it, is like, we also as officers have to acknowledge that it has happened, especially in the past. Like in the past, there was a certain way they did business. Like if you ran from the cops, you were going to get a beat down. Like there's this
Mhm.
mentality that they had back in the day and that they got away with because there were no cameras.
Yeah.
And so there was there's probably a lot of things that happened in the past that would definitely not fly today. As a matter of fact, I know there is, just based off of talking to people, talking to cops and criminals. The criminals will tell me, like the OGs I talked to, like, bro, back in the day, like if you got chased by the cops and they caught you, they were gonna beat you down. Stuff that wouldn't fly today. And so we also in law enforcement have to be willing to adapt and change as well. Like we can't just put it all in the community and say, look, you guys just got to shut up, keep your mouth shut. There's also ways for us to change the way we do business. I was telling somebody the other day, because he's getting ready to, one of my best friends, he's getting ready to leave the jails and go hit the streets, because he's been in the jails for like 4 or 5 years.
Ugh.
And so he's like, yeah, at the station I'm going to, it's one of those old school stations where they do a lot of they talk a lot of trash, and it's like they treat you like a boot and all this other stuff. And I told him, I was like, you know what, there's a point where I understand why you have to be stressed out, but there's a lot of stupid stuff that we still do in law enforcement that there's no need for it. Like, why are you making somebody feel like they're less than, as if we don't already have enough stresses going on?
Right.
So I think that's part of the culture. So we are going to talk about police culture. Those are some of the parts. Those are that's some of the culture that we do have to change. But that's culture that the public is not aware of. And so when we talk as police officers, is there a place for changing in profession and changing in culture? Yes, there is a place to change our culture. That's an example, but it's not what the public often views of how we change the culture. What they view as changing culture is what they see on TV.
Yeah. That's something that I talk about in my book, actually, Never Off Duty, is it like you said, it's not just up to the community to improve the relationship with law enforcement. It's up to us. It's up to the cops too. I've had some interactions as a private citizen with police officers in other states, and even in my home state, that were very unsavory, and not because they violated my rights or committed any crimes or anything, but just the tone and the demeanor they took with me, and the kind of the attitude. And I understand why they're that way, but like we talked about at the very beginning of this video, being in control of your emotions is key to being an effective police officer. And it's especially important if you're going to develop a good relationship with the general public and residents in your community. If you come across as this robotic, just dour, hardened, calloused, cop that just, he's salty and crusty and just, just tired of being on the job, you're not going to get very far with your community. But even, despite all of the stress and the drama and the toxicity that you have to put up with day to day, but you can still make a traffic stop at the end of your shift and be polite and be professional and be courteous. And like you said, in certain cases where it's appropriate, extend that grace, right? Extend that compassion and that mercy. That goes, it goes miles.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. It's a good conversation. I like it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So speaking of that, your mission, your goal, your endeavor with Breaking Barriers United, and I don't want to keep you here all night, but what's one of the biggest challenges that you find? I mean, your goal, if I understand it correctly, there's this gap, right? In that separates the general public from law enforcement, and you're doing what you can to bridge that. What's like the biggest challenge or the biggest roadblock that you've run into?
So I've identified that gap. When I say bridge the gap, that gap is misinformation and lack of education.
Okay.
Misinformation, lack of education is that gap that I try to build. I try to, provide good information, and I try to educate, and that's how you bridge. The hindrance from that sometimes is I have people that don't want to get out of their own way. If they come, and I've had this, it's so funny. I have followers that have been following. It's so funny how social media is. You start developing relationships with people you've never met them a day in your life, but they follow and they comment all the time. And so next thing you know, you just are constantly having dialogue. And so there's certain people that I've been tracking me from day one. And some of these people, man, from day one have been naysayers. Like, nope, like they'll let me have it. If I say something wrong, they'll let me have it. But they've been following me so long that over time, they've come out and told me, like, Ryan, like, I don't always agree with everything you say, but man, I got to say that you opened my eyes up to so much that I didn't know. And so much so that you've had me, even in my own community, like challenging the people that are in our community with when we see a viral video, and they almost look at me like I'm crazy. Like, are you siding with cops now? And they said it's uncomfortable. And I'm like, yeah, imagine how I freaking feel. But
Right.
but the reality is that they started getting challenged, and it's causing them to challenge other people.
Yeah.
And so I would say the biggest hindrance for me and my mission is the people that are afraid of siding with the police.
Yeah.
Sometimes they believe that if they see a video that's justified by them coming out openly and saying that it's justified, that their people in their group are going to automatically assume that now all of a sudden they're pro-police.
Okay.
So that's what I've always told people. I don't need you to be pro-police. I just need you to be willing to hear another side of it. And if it's fair, be able to say that it's fair, that this use of force was reasonable. So over time, I think that's been my biggest hindrance, is just people just afraid to get out of their comfort zone and be able to stand up for what's right. But we're moving. And when I get messages from both sides of the coin, I've gotten messages from officers and people in the community that tell me, hey, man, I've been following you for a long time, man. Keep doing what you're doing, man. Thank you for stepping out, doing it. That's what keeps me moving and keeps me motivated to continue to bridge that gap. But it definitely can be challenging sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, just like we established before, even if we're talking about someone who, like yourself, a long time ago, you were anti-cop, but then your eyes were open to the reality of it. And you're like, hey, I've been thinking about this all wrong. I didn't know the reality of it, but now I have a chance to tell other people about it. And I'm sure in the beginning you faced a lot of opposition and a lot of criticism. And you can't, if you believe that you're doing the right thing, you can't let opposition and criticism and any of that negative stuff stop you. So if you're one of those people who is on the fence, or you're approaching the fence and you're like, I want to know what's going on inside the world of law enforcement. I want to get to know our police officers. I want to know, what's going on in their world. I want to know the reality of it. And if your eyes are opened, you can't be afraid of what everybody else around you is going to think, right? Because if you let that stifle you, if you let that, like, if you withdraw because of that, then you're not gonna make any progress. You're not going to improve. You're not going to get to where you want to be.
Exactly. And that's why I admire you, bro. You did something that took courage, bro. It did. And let's just address it. I mean, what you did, the video you made, which was funny, by the way, but it took courage, because a lot of people wouldn't step out and do that. Did I think it was going to get you in trouble? Absolutely, I did. But that's just because I know how law enforcement is.
Yeah.
But I respect that, because it was ballsy, and you did it with the right heart. You did it to, like, really show, like, this is really the mindset that we've kind of come into as a profession. And so, it took guts, and what Tatum does, and a lot of people I respect, like Tatum. Tatum takes heat from so many different people. And even sometimes, like, I'll listen to Tatum and I'm like, man, like, that was gutsy. And we may not agree. I may not always agree with what Tatum says. I may not always agree with what you say, but that's what makes us human beings. Like, that's the great thing about living in our country. But slowly what's happening to our country, it's like the frog that died in the pot. Like, they put that frog in the water, and initially they start turning up the heat slowly to where the frog got comfortable. And next thing you know, he died, because he didn't realize how hot the water was getting. So that's what's going on in our country right now, is like, they're slowly taking things away from us. They're slowly taking your freedom of speech away, because somebody doesn't see things the way you see it. And if you get lulled to sleep in the process, the next thing you know, they will be able to remove your voice completely, and you're going to have to adhere to what the person says. So that's why I respect you. I respect Tatum and so many others out there that are willing to put their stuff on the line, right, wrong, or indifferent. I always tell people, if you want to be able to have a say so, or be able to challenge my opinion, then put some skin in the game first before you try to come at me.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, man. And likewise, I know that it's not easy doing what you do, going out there and, spreading the word, and you're preaching it, right? You're doing public speaking events. You're out there, you're sticking your neck out for a cause, and it's not always easy. Not everybody agrees with you, but I appreciate what you do too, man. It's and it means a lot. Those compliments coming from you. Where can people find you? Where can people find you on Instagram, Facebook?
So when IG doesn't crash,
I thought it was Skynet is self-aware. You know, they're coming for us. Like the next thing that the banks are going to shut down.
bro, as long as my crypto keeps going up, that's all I care. But so you guys can find me on IG and under Breaking Barriers United. You can find me on YouTube under Breaking Barriers United. I'm also on TikTok. I haven't posted in a while. I need to, but I'm on TikTok under Officer Tillman. And then we have a podcast as well, which we're gonna have you on, Nate, which is It's Needed, hashtag It's Needed. And so all one word, no cap, or all caps, no spaces. And you can find us on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, you name it, we're on all of it. So I do a lot of, my co-host for the podcast is AJ. You guys might follow him already. He goes by Oh No, it's a Popo. But and that's typically what I do. And so if you guys have questions or whatever, please follow me, reach out, hit me up on my DM. I can't guarantee I'll get to you guys in my DM. I mean, my DMs are flooded, but sometimes from time to time I'll go through them. And if I have a minute, I'll get back to you. And if you want me to come to your organization, whether it's police organization, whether it's your school, whatever, just reach out to me at info@breakingbarriersunited.com. Again, that's info@breakingbarriersunited.com. And just make a request for a speaking engagement, and I'll have my assistant get back to you guys. So that way we can I can get out there. So that's that.
Excellent. Yeah, go follow Ryan Tillman. He's got a lot of great content. I follow him. I follow his videos. Like you said, we agree pretty much on pretty much everything. I don't think there's been anything that we've disagreed on yet. We might disagree on something in the future, but like you said, that's the beauty of living in this country, is that we can disagree and then work it out and everything's fine.
And bro, usually those times in disagreements, I actually learn something.
Right.
And, I'm like, oh shoot, I never thought about it from that. There's something recently which has nothing to do with law enforcement, but I was so passionate about a certain situation. And it wasn't until I talked to somebody else that gave me a different viewpoint that it allowed me to see the angle that the person I was getting into it with was coming from. Yeah. And so, sometimes we got it, and that takes humility. So have a humble heart and a humble spirit, because if you're so gung-ho about it, you may not be able to get to that point that you need to get to.
Yeah, you never know. You might just learn something.
Yeah, exactly,
imagine that, right?
Exactly.
Well, thanks for joining me tonight, man. I really appreciate it. I had a good time discussing all this stuff with you.
Man, you too, Nate. You too, man. So I appreciate you. Appreciate everybody out there. And we got to do this. I'll have you on my podcast soon so we can share the wealth that way.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, everybody in the comments. Everybody who was in the chat, I appreciate your participation. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it, brother.
You too, bro.